Hello there, Peter from Universal Dork back again, and today I wanted to talk about the 1980s Twilight Zone, which ran from 1985 to 1989, and it remains one of my favorite horror anthology series of all time, hands down. It's right up there with the best episodes, Tales from the Dark Side, or Monsters, or even Tales from the Crypt. It also featured a lot of great guest stars, the likes of Bruce Willis, Morgan Freeman, Adrienne Barbeau, Martin Kove. Especially the first season is just jam-packed with familiar faces. And you know, this really doesn't get talked about very much these days. In fact, a lot of people that are into the genre, the horror genre, and sort of the sci-fi stuff, a lot of them have totally forgotten that this thing ever existed in the first place. A lot of times when I talk about the 1980s Twilight Zone, people think that I'm talking about the iconic anthology movie and controversial one from 1983. And that is kind of what inspired this revival in the 1980s of the Twilight Zone. But I'm not talking about the first movie. What I'm talking about today is this right here, which is, here it is, season 1 of the Twilight Zone from the 1980s. Yes, this is a true gem. It's got a ton of hits on this, of course. There are a few misses here and there, some filler episodes, but when this one is on, it hits hard. There's a lot of home runs on this. And this is a cool little DVD set that you can get. What I would really like would be for someone to step up to the plate and release this on Blu-ray. I understand, though, that when people are doing these brand new kind of cleaned up restoration Blu-rays, they're not exactly looking at restoring hours and hours of television. But I really think that it would be a really great thing to see this cleaned up, because there's some pretty cinematic stuff here that would look really great in 4K. So I don't want to really just cover the entire series today. What I really want to talk about is my favorite episode of the entire series, all the way, every season of them. The best episode of all time here is an episode, in my opinion, called Nightcrawlers, that is directed by William Friedkin. So the guy that did The Exorcist, Sorcerer, The French Connection, he did a movie from 1990, a horror film that I really love, that I think deserves a lot more attention and a bigger cult following, called The Guardian. You should check that one. It's got a pretty zany plot. But this series of The Twilight Zone from the 80s also featured a collection of pretty cool directors as well, like Wes Craven, a couple episodes from Joe Dante, that are all worth checking out, amongst, a whole bunch of other directors that did like lesser known B-movie kind of horror stuff that are definitely worth checking out. So some of the names you see in here, not only just the stars, but also the directors, are pretty impressive. So even though I'm going to say that Nightcrawlers is hands down the best episode of the series, there is one other episode that I was kind of struggling with choosing between at one point. It's an episode called Grandma, which is based on the Stephen King short story from Skeleton Crew of the same name. And that one's got Barrett Oliver from The Never-Ending Story as the lead in that, and that one is absolutely phenomenal. So it was kind of hard to pick between the two, but I would say if you want to go into this series with a bang, I would check out Nightcrawlers and Grandma. Those two, to me, are the two best. Now let's get into Nightcrawlers, the third segment of the fourth episode of the first season. I would say that one of the reasons why this one stands out above the crowd so much from all of the other installments here is because A, William Friedkin in the director's chair, and B, the cinematography, the action, and the sheer terror that's presented on screen was kind of unlike anything that anyone was seeing on regular TV at the time. Now, notably, this also stars Exene Cervenka from the punk band X, which I think is very interesting because this is kind of a rare performance from her as an actor. She's only appeared in a couple other things as a bona fide actor besides being in like music videos. There was a movie called Salvation from 1987 that I'm kind of curious to check out, where she stars alongside her then husband Viggo Mortensen, where apparently she is some sort of heavy metal Christian rocker, and somehow she rises to fame amongst it. It sounds like an interesting premise. The reviews on Letterboxd for it aren't that great, but it sounds like something that I'd probably be way into checking out at least once. This also features a pretty standout performance from this guy Scott Paullin, which I'm sure a lot of you probably recognize him from his 1990 role as the Red Skull in the Albert Pyun movie Captain America. I'm just kidding there, because there's not a lot of fans of that movie. I've really tried to like that one over the years, but he also starred in lesser roles in films like The Accused, Cat People, Turner and Hooch, and he also voiced this guy called Jasper T. Jowls, who was part of the Chuck E. Cheese entourage. Now, I'm sure there's some die-hard Chuck E. Cheese fans out there. You might want to take that little tidbit of trivia and tuck it in your back pocket. So the episode Nightcrawlers was based on a short story by this guy, Robert R. McCammon, who apparently was some sort of kind of iconic cult horror writer of the 70s and 80s. So right there, Friedkin knew that he had quite a good story to base this on, and I think that that's what kind of lured him into doing this project originally. Now, apparently Nightcrawlers was one of the hardest episodes to film of the 1980s Twilight Zone because of William Friedkin and the way that he approached this project. Now, that was the interesting thing here is apparently Friedkin approached Nightcrawlers like it was him shooting a movie. He did not give a flying fuck that this was for a TV audience. The way he approached this on set is that he was pushing everyone to the limit here. The cinematographer, everyone behind the camera, the actors, the lighting, everything here is pretty pristine. And you can tell that this guy is flexing his directorial skills to the max here, which is probably why this one translates so well to the small screen. Also notable here is that the score of Nightcrawlers was actually composed by this guy named Merle Saunders and also the Grateful Dead. Now that's another kind of interesting fact about the 1980s Twilight Zone is that the Grateful Dead, they also did the opening music for the show. So that whole that thing, they employed the Grateful Dead to do that. Kind of a bizarre choice, but I find that to be very intriguing. Notable in the score with the Grateful Dead, apparently you've got Huey Lewis from Huey Lewis and the News is providing the harmonica there. So go figure, that's pretty interesting. Huey Lewis getting in on the horror here. And this one has got a ton of horror jam-packed into it, lots of action, and it's just dripping with creepy atmosphere. That's one of the things that makes this one so damn effective. And the plot of this one has a really great setup. One of the tropes of a lot of the 70s and 80s stuff, and even the 90s, where you've got some sort of horrific scenario that is taking place on a little roadside diner in the middle of nowhere. Now, this one is taking place late at night during a wild thunderstorm. And that is the perfect setup for something really creepy. And Friedkin captures that vibe perfectly here. So we get introduced to a police officer who arrives into this little diner and he meets Exene Cervenka. Apparently they're kind of part of this small town community. Exene Cervenka is a waitress in there and she is also there with the cook. And that is where the setup takes place. Is we also see another family come in from the rainy night. They come into the diner, they're tired from driving and they just want to settle down for a little bit and get some grub. That's exactly what they do, but they have no idea what's in store for them as another man straggles into the diner as well. This guy looking like he's kind of like some sort of, best friend of John Rambo. He really does. He's got like real shaggy hair. He looks like he's clearly suffering from some sort of PTSD. And he's, donning this old green army jacket, and he kind of just wants to be left alone. And this small town sheriff, once he sees this guy come into the diner, his sort of like crazy detector goes off, and he will not let this guy drink a cup of coffee in peace. He starts questioning him and kind of prodding him, eventually getting some information out of him that this guy is a Vietnam vet. And he clearly does not want to talk about his time in the war. But this cop doesn't care. He's determined to get this guy to follow his orders. In fact, he wants to redirect him back to a hotel. He doesn't trust him driving by himself, and this guy just wants to be left alone. Well, this cop just will not stop. Eventually, this guy gets pushed too far, and we realize that what's going on inside of his head with his PTSD from the war, a lot of those things are manifesting into the real world right there in front of them. This guy has got some sort of strange, supernatural, almost like mutant power that he claims that he may have gotten from some sort of chemical that he was exposed to in the war. Well, you'd think after that, the police officer would just kind of let this guy chill out for a bit, but he doesn't. He keeps going at him hard, and that is when the shit hits the fucking fan here. And that's one of the best parts of this episode is kind of that build-up, this tension that goes on the entire time inside of this little foggy diner. And as this guy gets pushed further and further, things escalate, and people inside of the diner, the family that's there, Exene Cervenka and the cook, start becoming very uneasy. And it's right at that point that things go really off the rails when this guy shows what he is really capable of, as he's kind of pushed into like a very intense trance where he is recalling some of these events from the horrors of the War of Vietnam. So this is kind of a cautionary tale as well. So his fears are brought to life all around this little diner. This is where the real meat and potatoes of the episode really come into play here. Things become very cinematic, all due to Friedkin's dedication. So he was not phoning shit in. He wanted this thing to feel just as real as any movie that he put onto the big screen. And what manifests here outside is essentially this sort of hellish landscape covered in the bones of human beings, skulls, rib cages, everything, bones all over the place. The sky begins to light up with bombs dropping and explosions. And soon we see a group of zombie-like soldiers emerge from the hill behind this strange fog, and they descend upon this diner and attack everyone. And these guys, their faces are kind of rotting. They've got all of their weapons with them. There is no shortage of gunplay here, explosions. In fact, that was why this episode apparently was so hard to film, because Friedkin demanded to use, no miniatures. He wanted real explosions. We get to see real cars exploding, windows exploding. The inside of the cafe is just decimated by these bizarre, wicked soldiers from some other dimension, probably hell. And from listening to the commentary, there is actually a commentary track here for some of these episodes, which really make this a lot of fun, this particular set. So I checked this out, and they were talking about how the series of The Twilight Zone, after this one aired, they did not have a lot of return viewers. They lost a lot of viewership after that. And to the best of their knowledge, they can only guess that the people that were watching The Twilight Zone were kind of expecting that sort of 1960s vibe to this, which a lot of the other earlier ones that came before this one in the 1980s series had. Well, this one really went the distance, and at that time in 1985, people were not used to seeing this sort of horror and violence unfold on the small screen right in front of them. They were used to seeing that stuff in the theater. Even though this episode goes down as one of the best and is a total cult classic, a lot of the people that were behind the show sort of blame Friedkin's episode for ruining the viewership, meaning that it was just too gnarly for the general audiences watching TV at that time. And rewatching this again today, it's definitely made sense. I had no idea. He really brings it here, packs all of the horror and terror and action and explosions into 21 minutes. And damn, I've got to say, this is one of the best examples of just how talented William Friedkin was as a filmmaker. When you can take a short story like this and bring it to the small screen and give it the effectiveness of a large-scale horror flick. And again, what makes this one so effective here is that you can clearly see that Friedkin is squeezing the best possible performances he can out of the actors that he has at his disposal here. This Scott Pullen guy, apparently there was a story of him. Friedkin got right in his face during recording one of the scenes here, during filming one of the scenes here, got right in his face and grabbed him. And they had a little bit of a confrontation, and he pushed this guy in one of the scenes where he's totally freaking out to go the distance and go full crazy. And you can see the scene that I'm talking about right there, and you can tell that he's given it 110%, especially when you've got a director like William Friedkin in your face there demanding that you do better. So kudos to that. This is most definitely one of the best segments of a 1980s anthology horror series, or any sort of horror series in general, not just from the 80s. This one would stand in the top 5, if not maybe even number 1. If they were to have made a sequel to the 1983 Twilight Zone, the movie, this one, as the way it's filmed here, probably could have made a very amazing final segment. In fact, I've got a VHS here, Twilight Zone, the movie, part 2. I bet you've never seen that before. Take a look at that. Look at that. Some mysteriously bizarre VHS here that seems to have been pulled from an alternate dimension of reality, right out of the Twilight Zone. Well, a little secret here is I made this VHS for the shop probably 5 years ago. I liked some of these episodes of the Twilight Zone here so much. Some of them felt so cinematic to me that I thought, you know what, they really should have made a sequel to the original Twilight Zone, the movie. So I compiled them on here in sort of like a movie style, and I gave it the whole treatment here. Don't tell anyone. I know that this is sort of a controversial release here. But yeah, I put all of them on here, like Morgan Freeman's on an episode, Adrienne Barbeau. It concludes with Nightcrawlers. There's Robert Carradine's in one. I actually made two versions of this. There's another one with a different cover, but you know, if you're interested in getting one of these little strange little oddities pulled straight from the Twilight Zone, you know, hit me up in the comments and, you know, maybe we can work something out. I'm glad we've got all of these to enjoy. And there is another collection of the Twilight Zone, which features season 2 and the much shorter season 3. Now, I will say season 2 and 3, there's some pretty good episodes in that one, but they're not nearly as good as and consistent, I will say, as the Twilight Zone series from 1985, which is the first season. All right, so that's all that I've got for you today. I want to talk about Grandma sometime soon. I also want to talk about some other odd 1980s anthologies. I would really like to talk about the new Alfred Hitchcock Presents from the 1980s. There are some total bangers in that one as well. And I've got a favorite episode of that particular series that we'll be getting to. Okay, so that's it for me today. Check out the 1985 Twilight Zone and let me know what you think about it. Are you a fan already? What is your favorite episode of the 1980s Twilight Zone? And hey, do you think that some of these are just as good as the original series from, you know, the 60s? I say it's just as good. Maybe that's just the 80s kid in me. Either way, let me know what you think, and I will see you next time.